while the Coalition Council debated whether to respond to the Vorkai ceasefire message, while the diplomats drafted careful language and the senior officers argued about timing and tone, the Unbroken Will slipped quietly out of its position near Cathara Station and repositioned itself at the edge of the Vorkai fleet's primary escape corridor, the route home, the wide lane of clear space between the front lines and Vorkai core territory, the road that any retreating fleet would need to use if the war ended and they wanted to go home. It parked itself there and went dark. No active communications, no weapon locks, no threatening posture of any kind. Just present. Just there. A very large, very scarred, very real reminder that the war was not over until Captain Vasquez decided the terms were good enough. When the Vorkai fleet commanders noticed the repositioning, their next ceasefire message arrived significantly faster than the first one. Considerably more flexible. The negotiations lasted 11 days. They were conducted by coalition diplomats and Vorkai representatives in a neutral station, with Admiral Serthan present as the senior military observer. Corporal Osei sat behind Serthan and took notes. Captain Vasquez was not present in the room. She stayed on her ship. But the Vorkai negotiators were aware of exactly where the Unbroken Will was at all times. And that awareness shaped every conversation in the room, whether anyone mentioned the ship or not. The final terms were better than anyone in the coalition had imagined possible a year ago. The Vorkai agreed to withdraw from all occupied coalition systems, to return prisoners of war within 90 days, to dismantle the forward bases they had built in contested space, and to recognize the coalition's territorial boundaries for a period of no less than 20 years. It was not a perfect peace, but it was a real one, the kind that had weight to it and teeth, not just words. On the last day of the negotiations, the lead Vorkai diplomat, a senior female officer named Kethvara, who had been cold and precise and completely unreadable throughout the entire process, paused before leaving the room and looked at Sarathon directly. "Tell your human captain," she said, "that she plays a complicated game well. She did not wait for a response, and she did not offer one herself. She walked out, and the room exhaled." Sarathon passed the message along to Vasquez. Her reply was, "Thank her for me." The war was over. Officially, formally, on record. The holograms in every coalition station and vessel were updated to show the new borders, and for the first time in 3 years, the map had no moving lines. It simply sat there, still and blue and whole, and people looked at it for a long time without saying much. The memorials came first, quiet ceremonies on 7 worlds for the people who had not made it to end. Then the formal events, the speeches, the recognition ceremonies. The coalition held its official Victory Acknowledgement Assembly at Station Pallor 9, where the War Council had first received the Vorkai ceasefire message, and every senior representative of every member species was present. Sarathan delivered the address. He had written it himself 3 times, and thrown out the first 2 drafts because they were not honest enough. The final version said what he actually believed, which was harder to write but more worth saying. He stood at the podium in his formal uniform and looked out at the assembled faces and said that the coalition had survived, not because it was powerful, which it was, and not because it was right, which he believed it was, but because at the moment it most needed help, it had been humble enough to ask for it. And he said that the species it had asked, a species it had once dismissed and underestimated and quietly laughed at, had answered with. 1 ship and 1 captain had changed the direction of the war by refusing to accept the direction it was already going. He paused there, and the room was very quiet. He said, "We did not win because we outgunned the Vorkai. We did not win because our technology was superior or our numbers were greater. We won because something came to stand beside us that the Vorkai could not calculate and could not predict and could not break. And that thing was not the ship and it was not the weapons. It was the human refusal, the refusal to look at a losing war and accept that it had already been lost. After the formal address, the Coalition Council held a closed session. Sarathon was not surprised by the proposal that came forward, but he was moved by it. A unanimous vote, all 7 species, to offer humanity a permanent seat on the Joint War Council. Not an observer seat, not a junior partnership, a full seat, equal voice, equal standing. The vote took less than 3 minutes, and no one argued against it. Captain Vasquez attended the official ceremony in her service uniform. The plain gray jacket, the rank insignia, the scorch marks still on the left shoulder from the conduit fire during the Battle of Cathara. Sarathon had quietly asked Corporal Osei before the event whether the captain owned a formal uniform. Osei had smiled and said she did, yes, but that she had chosen not to wear it. She wants them to see the jacket, he said. She wants everyone in that room to know that the person sitting at the table is the same person who was on the bridge. Vasquez sat at the council table between Sarathon and Ambassador Liss, and received the formal recognition with steady eyes and no speech. When prompted by the ceremony host to say a few words, she said, "We won't let you down." Then she sat back, and that was all. After the ceremony, when the formal hall was emptying, and people were standing in small groups talking quietly, a young Thelian ensign approached Corporal Osei. She was maybe 3 years out of the academy, with wide dark eyes, and the uncertain posture of someone who has a question they are not sure they should ask. She had been assigned to Station Powler 9 for the last 6 months, and had watched the war turn from this station's observation deck. She looked at Osei for a moment, and then asked him, genuinely, without any of the diplomatic caution the older officers used, what were humans actually like, back home, in normal life, when there was no war? Osei looked at the ceiling briefly, thinking. He had been in the military his whole adult life, and sometimes forgot what the answer to that question felt like. Then he smiled, a real one, the wide, easy kind. Honestly, he said, kind of a mess. We argue a lot, we're very loud, we disagree about almost everything, we make big mistakes, and then argue about those too. But when someone needs us, when something is really, actually wrong, and someone needs help, there is nowhere in this galaxy you would rather have us standing next to you. The ensign looked past him, through the wide observation window, at the unbroken will still docked in the station berth. It was lit now on one side by the soft gold light of the nearby sun, the old scars on its hull catching the light in long silver lines. It was still the largest thing she had ever seen up close, still dark, still heavy, still marked by everything it had been through. It did not look like a monument. It looked like a ship that was ready to go out again, if it needed to. The ensign stood there looking at it for a long time, and she did not say anything, because she had run out of questions. After the 3rd month of reversals, small losses but losses, the Vorkai High Command did what powerful organizations always do when they cannot understand why they are losing. They looked for information. They assigned their best intelligence analysts to study the human military, the human ship, and most particularly the human captain. They wanted patterns, weaknesses, limitations. They wanted the thing that would make the math work again. What they found did not make the math work. What they found frightened them in a way that weapons fire had not. Analyst Veth Oran was the senior intelligence officer assigned to the project, a long-limbed Vorkai with careful yellow eyes and a reputation for cold, precise thinking. He had spent his career reading enemies and finding the soft places in them. He sat in his office on the Dominion's command station for 2 weeks and read everything his division could gather on humanity, and at the end of those 2 weeks, submitted a report to High Command that was 11 pages long and very, very quiet in tone. The report said, essentially, this: humanity had been at war with itself for virtually the entire length of its recorded history. Not small wars, not border skirmishes, massive, civilization-threatening wars, fought with every weapon they could imagine, against enemies who shared their own biology and their own planet, and sometimes their own families. They had survived plagues that killed hundreds of millions. They had survived weapons they invented specifically to destroy themselves in large numbers. They had collapsed empires, burned cities, and rebuilt both, repeatedly, across thousands of years, and through all of it, they had kept going. Every strategy in the current conflict that the Vorkai considered advanced or innovative, humanity had field-tested on itself at some point in its past. The feigned retreat, the psychological operation, the supply line disruption, coordinated strike from multiple angles. All of it was in human history books, used by humans against other humans, refined over centuries of practice. What the Unbroken Will was doing in this war was not new to humanity. It was old. It was what they had always done. Vethorin's report included one line that circulated quietly through Vorkai High Command for days afterward, passed from one senior officer to another without comment, because none of them could think of the right comment to make. The line was, "The humans are not a young species that has learned war. They are a war species that has recently learned to reach space, and there is a significant difference." A Vorkai strike team captured 2 human crew members from a damaged shuttle near the Ascari border. Both were treated according to Dominion prisoner protocols, which meant they were kept alive and questioned. The senior of the 2 was a human engineer named Harlan Bosch, a stocky man in his late 30s, with a broken nose that had healed slightly crooked, and the kind of steady, unhurried eyes that made the Vorkai interrogators uncomfortable. He answered questions about the ship's technical systems with a pleasant vagueness that revealed nothing useful. When asked about Captain Vasquez, he said simply that she was very good at her job, and that her crew would follow her into a star if she pointed at one. The Vorkai interrogators reported back to Vethoron that the human prisoners showed no signs of fear under questioning. Not the controlled, suppressed fear that most prisoners showed, which was still fear, but genuine, baseline calm, as if captivity was an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Vethoron added this to his notes with a thin, uncomfortable feeling he did not have a precise word for. The captured human engineer was eventually transferred to the Unbroken Will in a prisoner exchange. Before he left, the Vorkai facility commander, a senior officer, named Dreth Khan, met with him briefly. Dreth Khan asked him directly, as one military officer to another, how humans managed to function so effectively in environments of such extreme stress. Bosch scratched the side of his crooked nose and thought about it. "We've had a lot of practice," he said. "Bad things happened to us for a very long time, and we kept showing up anyway. Eventually, that becomes a habit." Dreth Khan did not find this comforting. The Vorkai High Command held a strategy session that lasted 3 days. Vethoron presented his full findings to the assembled senior officers, including one section of his report that dealt specifically with what he called the psychological pressure inventory. This was the list of tactics the Dominion had used successfully against coalition species to break their will to fight. Isolation, attrition, the destruction of symbols and strongholds, the killing of senior officers to break unit cohesion, lines to create hopelessness. He went through each one and noted for each specific examples from human history where humans had faced the same pressures from other humans and had not broken. Isolation had been used against them. They had carved tunnels and kept fighting underground. Attrition had been used against them. They had drafted civilians and kept fighting in the streets. Their cities had been burned. They had rebuilt them and returned. Their senior officers had been killed. They had promoted the next one in line and kept moving. The Dominion had no tool in its psychological warfare kit that humans had not already survived at least once. The session ended without a clear resolution, which was itself unusual, because Vorkai strategy sessions always ended with a clear resolution. But there was a new feeling in the room, sitting quietly in the corner like an uninvited guest that no one acknowledged. The feeling was, perhaps this war has already changed in a way we cannot change back. The captured officer, a young Vorkai pilot who had been taken during the engagement near the Drath border, was transported to the Unbroken Will for holding and later exchange. During his time aboard the human ship, he was treated carefully and kept in a secure but comfortable area. Captain Vasquez visited him once. He asked her, through a translation device, why the humans had chosen to help species who had refused to accept them as equals not long ago. Vasquez sat in the chair across from him and was quiet for a moment. Because people were dying, she said. That's the whole reason. People were dying, and we could do something about it. The pilot asked a second question, one that had been in Vethorin's report, the one question the analyst said he most wanted answered. How was it possible that humans had spent so many thousands of years trying to destroy each other, and had not succeeded? Vasquez looked at him steadily. We are also very, very good at deciding when to stop, she said. She paused, and her voice was flat and clear as glass. We haven't decided that yet. The pilot was quiet for the rest of his time on the ship. 3 days after that conversation, the Vorkai High Command sent the first quiet private communication to the Coalition. Not an offer of peace, not yet. Just a message that said they were willing to discuss the terms of a ceasefire. It was the first time in 3 years that they had used the word ceasefire. The Coalition Council received the message and sat very still for a long moment, reading it again and again, making sure it said what it appeared to say. The Unbroken Will moved to the front lines 3 days after its arrival at Station Pallor 9, and the Coalition watched what happened next with a mixture of fascination and deep, genuine unease. The first engagement took place at the edge of the Maloon system, where a Vorkai advance fleet of 14 warships had been pushing forward in a slow, steady line. The kind of movement that said, we are not in a hurry because we do not need to be in a hurry. They had used this same formation in 7 previous engagements, and 7 times it had worked. The Coalition vessels sent to meet them had either been destroyed or forced to fall back. The math was always the same. The result was always the same. Captain Vasquez did not fight the math. The Unbroken Will came out of FTL, not in front of the Vorkai line, where a defending ship was supposed to appear, but behind it, deep behind it, already between the advance fleet and its supply vessels, in the exact position where no one, ship, had any business being if it intended to survive the next hour. The Vorkai fleet commander had to turn his entire formation around, which broke the line, which created gaps, and through those gaps, 3 Coalition frigates that had been waiting in a nearby asteroid field came pouring at full speed. It was not a battle so much as a collapse. The Vorkai formation fell apart trying to respond to 2 threats that should not have been able to coordinate, and the advance fleet lost 4 ships before it managed to pull back. Sarathon watched the engagement record twice, then a 3rd time. Then he called Corporal Ose into his office and asked him to explain what he had just watched. A standard hammer and anvil, sir, Ose said, like it was the most obvious thing in the galaxy. You place pressure from the front, your main force hits from the rear. The enemy has to choose which direction to face, and whichever one they choose, the other one hurts them. This tactic, Sarathan said carefully. It is in our military doctrine. Our strategists have studied it for years. Yes, sir, Ose said, but there's a difference between knowing a tactic and being willing to actually use it. A hammer and anvil only works if the anvil is willing to take a beating while the hammer gets into position. Your fleets have been protecting themselves. Captain Vasquez doesn't protect the ship, she uses it. Sarathan did not have a response to that, so he dismissed the corporal and sat alone, thinking about the difference between knowing a thing and being willing to do it. The second engagement was more intense. The Battle of Kethera Station, which every Coalition officer who witnessed it would remember for the rest of their lives, and describe to anyone who would listen for the rest of their lives after that. Kethera Station was a Coalition resupply hub. The Vorkai wanted it destroyed, because it fed the Coalition's last remaining defensive line in the eastern sectors. They sent 22 ships, a serious number, the kind of number that said, "We know this matters." The coalition had 11 ships to defend with, plus the unbroken will. The battle began in the standard way. Weapons fire, maneuvering, the terrible noise of a ship taking a hit. The coalition vessels fought hard, but they were being pushed back, as they had been pushed back before. Then a Vorkai command cruiser, the heaviest ship in the enemy formation, turned its guns directly on the unbroken will and opened fire at close range. It was the kind of broadside that was meant to end a ship, heavy and concentrated and merciless. Every coalition officer watching the feed expected the unbroken will to pull back. Damaged ships pulled back. That was what ships did, because ships were expensive and crews were irreplaceable, and the calculation of survival demanded retreat. The unbroken will accelerated forward. It moved directly into the fire, absorbing the shots across its already scarred hull, damage blooming across its port side in great orange flashes. And it did not stop. It increased speed, drove straight toward the command cruiser, and at the last moment angled its reinforced bow directly into the cruiser's midsection at full thrust. The impact was visible from every ship in the engagement. The command cruiser broke apart, and the unbroken will came through the debris fields still moving, trailing fire from 3 locations on its hull, guns already turning to find the next target. In the coalition command vessel, the observation room was silent. Admiral Sarathon realized he was gripping the edge of his console hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. He became aware of Corporal Ose standing beside him, and he turned and looked at the young human and said in a voice that he could not fully control, "They are insane." Ose was watching the screen, not with fear, Sarathon noticed, but tempered Hoken. But with something that looked like pride, and also something that looked like relief. The corporal said quietly, "No, sir, they are motivated." The Vorkai lost 9 ships at Kethera. They had not lost 9 ships in a single engagement in 2 years. More importantly, they pulled back afterward and did not press the attack, which was something the Vorkai had never done before. The Vorkai did not pull back from fights they believed they could win. But the engagement at Kethera had introduced a variable their battle models could not calculate. And for a species that ran on calculation, an uncalculated variable was more frightening than firepower. Because the unbroken will did not follow patterns. It did not follow the patterns because it did not fight the way patterns expected. Captain Vasquez never did the same thing twice in the same way. She feinted where she was expected to attack, attacked where she was expected to feint, and in one remarkable engagement near the Drath border, she allowed her ship to appear badly damaged and adrift in order to bait a Vorkai pursuit fleet into a minefield that her crew had spent 16 hours laying in secret. The explosion that followed removed 6 Vorkai vessels from the battlefield permanently, and the 7 that survived limped home. The coalition began to win small engagements, then medium ones. The line on the map, which had been moving in one direction for 3 years, stopped moving. Then slowly, impossibly, it began to move the other way. In the Vorkai fleet, something new was happening, something that their commanders had no good word for because they had not needed a word for it before. Their officers were hesitating. Junior commanders were asking senior commanders for confirmation before acting, which slowed every response. Senior commanders were running the same scenarios multiple times, looking for the human variable, the thing that did not fit. Would come from that the model had not predicted. And while they were running their models, the moment for action was passing. Sarathan noticed it first in the battle reports. The Vorkai response times were getting longer. Not by much, just by seconds in most cases. But in the fast mathematics of space combat, seconds were everything. He brought it to Corporal Ose, who read the reports and nodded slowly. "She's getting in their heads," Ose said. "The captain, she's not just fighting their ships, she's fighting their confidence. When you can't predict your enemy, you stop trusting your own plans. And when you stop trusting your plans, you fight slower and slower, until you stop fighting at all. Sarathan looked at the map. The red was still there, still vast and still heavy, but it was not moving. For the first time in 3 years, it was not moving. He allowed himself one quiet breath of something that felt almost like hope. Sarathan was in the middle of a tactical briefing when his communications officer interrupted. The young Thelian ensign looked confused, which was never a good sign in a communications officer. "Admiral," she said carefully, "we have received a reply from human space. They are coming." Sarathan straightened in his chair. "How many ships?" The ensign looked down at her screen and then back up. "1, Admiral." The briefing room went very quiet. Sarathan stared at the ensign for a long moment, waiting for her to correct herself or add something. She did not. He looked at Counselor Dren, who had been sitting in on the briefing. Dren's wide gray face was unreadable, but his jaw was tight. Ambassador Felix, who had been standing near the door reviewing a datapad, let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough. "1 ship," Felix said. "They sent 1 ship. We are at war with the most powerful military force in this region of the galaxy, and they sent 1 ship. I told you this was a waste of time." Sarathan did not respond to that. He looked back at his ensign. "What class of vessel?" She checked again. "They call it a Titan-class battleship, Admiral. The designation is UES Unbroken Will. Crew complement listed at 4,200 personnel." She hesitated. "Admiral, I am cross-referencing their ship classification database. A Titan class is their largest warship category. They have built 11 of them in the last 20 years. That was something, at least. Sarathan filed the number away and said nothing. The Unbroken Will arrived at Coalition Defense Station Pallor 9 16 hours later. Sarathan was on the station's main observation deck when it came out of faster-than-light travel, and the sight of it stopped the conversation in the room, the way a very loud noise stops a conversation. Not because anyone told people to be quiet, but because quiet just happened on its own. The ship was enormous, not in the elegant, stretched way of most Coalition vessels, which were built long and thin, like needles designed to cut through space. The Unbroken Will was broad and heavy and dark, built the way a wall is built, like something that was not designed to move gracefully, but to stand in front of things and refuse to fall. Its hull was the deep black of space itself, and across that black surface there were scars, long gray lines where old damage had been repaired, darker patches where plating had been replaced, and in a few places on the lower hull, damage that had not been repaired at all, as if whoever maintained the ship had decided the marks were worth keeping. The ship wore its history on the outside, and it did not seem embarrassed about any of it. Sarathan opened a communication channel. Protocol required the senior coalition officer to initiate contact. He expected a young captain, perhaps eager, perhaps nervous, had prepared himself to be patient and polite, and quietly disappointed. The face that appeared on the screen was not what he had prepared for. Captain Elena Vasquez looked to be somewhere in her middle years by human standards. Sarathan had studied enough human biology to make that estimate. Her dark hair was cut short and neat. Her jaw was set with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from discipline. And her eyes were the color of deep water, not warm water, the cold, deep kind, the kind where things lived that had never seen sunlight. She was not in formal attire, just a plain gray military jacket with rank insignia on the shoulder. She was sitting very straight, and she was looking directly at the camera with an expression that contained no apology and no explanation for arriving as a single ship in answer to a 3-year war. "Admiral Sarathan," she said. Her voice was even and unhurried. "I am Captain Elena Vasquez of the UES Unbroken Will. I have reviewed the summary you attached to your distress beacon. I need your complete tactical database. Current Vorkai fleet positions, supply routes, command structure, engagement records from the last 6 months, and any behavioral data your intelligence division has on Vorkai commanding officers. Please transmit everything you have, and I would appreciate it quickly." Sarathon blinked. He had expected a greeting, possibly condolences about the state of the war, perhaps an offer of solidarity. "Captain Vasquez," he said, "before we discuss data transfer, I want to be direct. We sent a request for military assistance. We were hoping for—" "A fleet," she said, not unkindly, just accurately. "I know, I understand what you were hoping for. I need you to trust that what I brought is sufficient for what I intend to do. But I cannot explain my intentions until I understand the battlefield. The data, Admiral, please." He sent the data, not because he was fully convinced, but because her directness had knocked him slightly off balance, and he could not think of a good reason to refuse. What happened next surprised him more than the ship had. The Unbroken Will's crew processed the entire Coalition tactical database in under 3 hours. 3 hours for a data package that the Coalition's own strategic analysts had been working through for weeks. Then the questions came back, and they were not the questions Sarathon expected. A Coalition strategist asked about enemy firepower and fleet counts. The humans asked about Vorkai sleep cycles and the average age of their commanding officers. A Coalition analyst asked about defensive positions. The humans asked about the psychological pressure the Vorkai put on their own junior officers. One human intelligence officer sent a message directly to Sarathon's desk, asking whether the Coalition had ever attempted a feigned retreat in Sector 7, and what the Vorkai response had. Sarathon answered every question. He answered them late into the station's night cycle, long after his own staff had gone to rest. And with each answer, he felt something change in his chest, something small but real. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too large and too fragile for what was happening. It was something quieter than hope, more like the feeling of a door that had been stuck, finally beginning to move. Corporal Danny Osei was the Unbroken Will's Coalition liaison officer, a young human man with a wide, easy smile and dark skin, and the habit of bouncing slightly on his heels when he was thinking. He had been assigned to Sarathon's staff for the duration of the operation. On the second evening after the ship's arrival, Sarathon found him in the station cafeteria, eating something unidentifiable and reading from a small personal screen. "Your captain," Sarathon said, sitting across from the corporal. "She does not seem concerned. 1 ship, 3 years of war, and she does not seem concerned." Osei looked up and smiled. "She's very concerned, sir. That's why she wanted the data first. A concerned person who doesn't have information is just scared. A concerned person with information is a problem for whoever she's concerned about." Sarathon thought about that for a long time after he returned to his quarters. Outside the station's wide windows, the Unbroken Will sat dark and still and massive against the stars, every scar on its hull lit faintly by the light of a distant sun. It did not look like rescue. It did not look like hope. It looked like something very old that had been through a very great deal and had not broken yet. He decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that this was exactly what he needed it to look like. Fleet Admiral Sarathon stood at the wide observation window of his command vessel and watched another allied planet die. He had watched 3 die this month alone, and each time it felt like a punch to the chest that never fully stopped hurting. The orbital defense grids of planet Verith flickered on his tactical screen and then disappeared one by one, like candles being blown out by a storm. Within 6 hours, the Vorkai Dominion had stripped the planet's sky of every ship, every station, and every last defense the Coalition had placed there. 6 hours. That was all it took. Sarathon was tall even for a Thelian. His silver-gray skin was pulled tight across sharp features, and his 4 dark eyes had seen a great deal of war in his long life. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing in any military school, no battle simulation, no ancient text of Thelian war strategy had prepared him for the Vorkai. Been at war with someone for nearly 400 years. They were reptilian, calculating, and patient in a way that most species could not match. They did not rush into battle. They planned, they measured, they waited. And then they struck with a precision that felt less like war and more like surgery. They cut away defenses before the enemy knew the cut had happened. They destroyed supply lines before a single weapon was ever fired. And when they finally arrived at a planet, the fight was already over, in every way that mattered. The Galactic Coalition had 7 member species: the Thelians, the Prin, the Ascari, the Maloon, the Drath, the Fen, and the Soleki. 7 civilizations, each old and proud and powerful in their own right. And yet for 3 years they had been losing, steadily, painfully, and without any sign that the bleeding would stop. Sarathan moved away from the window and walked toward the War Council chamber. The corridor was quiet, hated. Quiet on a warship meant people were afraid to speak, and afraid people made poor soldiers. The council chamber was a round room with a long curved table and chairs built for bodies of many different shapes and sizes. The representatives of all 7 species were already seated when Sarathan entered. Their faces told him everything. They were tired, and worse than tired, they were beginning to look defeated. Councillor Dren of the Drath sat with his wide gray head resting in both hands. Ambassador Felik of the Maluan had not cleaned his ceremonial coat, which told Sarathan that the small, feathered diplomat had not slept. Even Grand Elder Voss of the Seleki, who was usually the calmest voice in any room, looked like someone carrying a weight that was too heavy for her old shoulders. The holographic display in the center of the table showed the current state of the war. It was not a good map to look at. Red marked Vorokai-controlled space, and there was great deal of red. The blue of coalition territory had shrunk like a fire going out, pulling back from the edges, thinning in the middle. 3 years ago the map had been mostly blue. Today it was mostly red, and the borders were still moving. "We need to discuss options," Sarathan said as he took his seat. His voice was steady. He had trained it to be steady, even when his mind was screaming. "We have discussed options," said Councillor Dren without lifting his head. "We have discussed options for 3 years. The Vorkai do not care about our options." No one argued with him. It was Ambassador Liss of the Prin who finally said the thing that everyone in that room had been refusing to say for weeks. Liss was small and pale, with wide copper-colored eyes, and a quiet voice that somehow always carried across any room. She set both her slim hands flat on the table, and looked at no one in particular when she spoke. Silence that followed was the loudest kind, the kind that has many opinions in it, but not enough courage to let any of them out. Then the voices came. "The humans are children," said Felik of the Miluan. "Their civilization is barely 40 years in space. They have no fleet worth speaking of, no experience in galactic warfare, and their emotional instability is well documented." Grand Elder Voss of the Seleki pressed her fingertips together and said nothing. But her expression was not dismissive. It was thoughtful, which was different. Sarathan remembered when humanity had first applied for coalition membership. It had been 17 years ago. The application had included a long list of their military capabilities, their technological achievements, and their willingness to contribute to galactic peace. The Council at the time had reviewed it and declined. Politely, carefully, and with a great deal of very diplomatic language that nonetheless meant, "You are too young, too strange, and too dangerous to yourselves for us to take seriously." Some members of that old council had laughed after the humans left the chamber. Not cruelly, just with the easy confidence of people who believed they understood how the galaxy worked. Sarathan had not laughed. He had not known why at the time. Something about the human representative's eyes had stayed with him, something steady and old-looking in a young face. He had filed the feeling away and forgotten it until now. "The humans were denied membership because we considered them unstable," Sarathan said. He looked at Liss. "What makes you think they would help us now?" "Because we are losing," Liss said simply, and they will know that. And from everything in our cultural records about humans, losing is exactly the kind of situation that makes them want to get involved. There was more argument after that. There always was. But the argument grew smaller as the hour grew. Later, and the red on the map did not change. Eventually, quietly, a vote was taken. It was not a proud vote. It was the kind of vote that people cast when they have run out of better ideas. The distress beacon was prepared and coded that same night. It was sent to the edge of human-occupied space, with a short message attached, a summary of the war, and a careful, humble request for assistance. No one in the chamber expected much. Felix privately told his aide he expected no response at all. Sarathon stood again at the observation window after the others had gone. He looked at the stars for a long time. Somewhere out past the edge of what he could see, the beacon was moving toward human space. He did not know what would come back. He only knew that whatever came, it would not be enough. Nothing felt like enough anymore. He turned off the light in his cabin and tried to sleep. The stars kept burning outside his window, cold and indifferent, and very far away.